Awesome. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our panel as part of the Nonprofit Governance Symposium. Thanks for continuing to hang out with us today and make it to the second round of breakouts. I am joined in the studio by Dan Miller, one of our panelists today, and joined online by Anna Diaz, who is a partner with Dowling and Yankee, and also Ann Tart, who is a founding principal at Sustainability Next. So thank you all for joining our panel on how to integrate ESG, environment, social governance, into your mission and finances. So before we kind of get started with the panel and dialogue and some presentations, I'd love to just, get us all grounded into this space together and kind of, ask a question to our attendees. So we're going to be doing a word cloud feature. So looking at how you would, waiting for that to come up there. Directions on how to respond to this word cloud in the chat. But so in one-word phrases, based on your current understanding, how would you describe the value of ESG to your work? So as we get some answers in here, again, you can respond using that link in the chat, and let's see how we get started. Sounds great. So as people are getting oriented and starting to respond, maybe I can pose this question to our panel really quick to kick us off. So in a one-word phrase, Dan, since we're sitting here together, how would you describe the value of ESG to your work?
I would say intersectional.
Awesome. How about Anna?
I would say rekindling values, really impacting values.
Amazing. And Anne?
I guess I would say stakeholder impact.
Awesome. Yeah, these are all great things. We'll touch on a little bit more of this in detail with our panel in a few. But being mindful of time, let's maybe get started. And I'll hand it over to Ann Tart, who is the founder and principal at Sustainability Next, to share some of her recent research on this to help us get grounded.
Thank you, Darby, and hello to everyone, and thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for inviting me to. Can you hear me? Okay. Right. So I'm Ann Tart. I founded a sustainability consulting firm. We work with private sector companies, nonprofits, and collaboratives to help them achieve their sustainability objectives. And today I'm just going to provide a little bit of context for the panel, talking a little bit about what's happening in the private sector on ESG, because there's so much going on in that world right now, and it could help inform, and we can compare and contrast what's happening in the nonprofit world. And also share some data from a survey we did recently in the San Diego region looking at nonprofits and ESG reporting. So if you go to the next slide, just to make sure we're all on the same page, for anyone who's not familiar with the terminology, ESG is really just kind of the latest iteration in terminology for the concept of sustainability, or what sometimes is called social responsibility, or in the corporate world, corporate social responsibility. And this phrase of ESG has been coming up in more recent years. It's a phrase in the private sector that particularly investors have been using. So that's the latest jargon. But the bottom line is that any framework that you look at around sustainability just looks at these three components: the environment, health of our society, and social issues, as well as governance, which covers ethics and things like that. So it's kind of like the three-legged stool that you might have heard about in the old days when the concept of sustainability still first emerged. So for the next slide, we just wanted to give a little bit of context from the private sector, just to say that there is a lot going on in this world, and the number of companies in the Standard & Poor's 500 index, which is some of the largest companies in the country here in the US, that have started reporting on their ESG activities, grew from 20% in 2011 to 90% in 2019, and probably even larger in the last year, but 2019 is the last year for which we have data. So there's really been a lot going on in that sector, and all the major brands that you could think of, Coca-Cola, Levi's, AT&T, and others like that, pretty much everyone has some sort of ESG activity or program and some sort of annual report where they're talking to stakeholders about it. The next slide is, and why are they doing this? And there's many reasons they're doing it, many drivers, and we'll talk about some of the drivers for the nonprofit sector as well. But one of the main ones is that we have good evidence now that companies that are doing well on being responsible on their environmental and social issues and ethical and equity issues are actually performing better financially. So there's a real financial driver behind what's happening in the private sector world. And that chart just shows a little bit of that. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but just wanted to provide some of that context. In the nonprofit world, if you go to the next slide, why is it important that nonprofits be thinking about ESG? Well, certainly that financial component, there are financial savings and advantages to looking at ESG issues, and we can talk more about that in the discussion. But in addition to that, there's other reasons why it makes sense for nonprofits. And again, I think we're going to get into this more in discussion, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on the slide, but really just trying to be responsive to stakeholders. A big piece of what's driving it in the private sector, and this should be true in the nonprofit sector as well, is that employees, especially the younger generations, millennials and younger, are very interested in these issues. And so doing something about ESG is a good recruitment and retention tool in what is a pretty tight labor market these days. It can help us reduce environmental impacts and risks that are associated with those. There's a lot of reasons that it makes sense for nonprofits, in addition to financial and attracting and retaining donors. So if you go to the next slide, there's also, especially for the nonprofit sector, kind of a moral imperative. This is just a quote from Pope Francis from his encyclical a few years ago, talking about the connection between environmental issues and social issues, and the need to really look at that holistically. The next slide. So how does the nonprofit sector measure up to what we're seeing in the private sector right now? One marker is there's something called the Global Reporting Initiative, and in short GRI, which is the most commonly used framework that entities use when they are trying to put together their communication around ESG. And it sets out standards and principles for how this should be done. And there's a bunch of specific topics and metrics that you can use if you want to report on a specific topic. And thousands of companies a year submit these reports to the entity that kind of monitors the GRI standards. And only looking at the research for the last 15 years, only 30 nonprofits in the US have done that. So there's a big difference between the amount of reporting in the private sector versus nonprofit. But we wanted to dig a little bit more into the San Diego region in particular. And so a few months ago with a PBO advisory, which is one of our partners in the San Diego region, they do accounting and management consulting for nonprofits. We conducted a small survey and tried to get a cross sector of nonprofit organizations and sent it out to about 75 nonprofit leaders and got a 43% response rate, which we thought was pretty good, and really a nice cross sector of organizations in the region. And I want to share some of those results with you next, just so you can see where things are. The first question we asked was really just how familiar are you with this concept of ESG or ESG reporting? And you can see from the chart that it's a little more than half, about 55% of respondents were either somewhat familiar with the concept or very familiar with it. So that's good. We've got a little bit more than half of nonprofit leaders that we surveyed who are familiar, but there's also a fair amount that have maybe heard of it, but in that yellow bar, heard of it, but don't really know what it is. And about 15% of respondents who said that they really weren't familiar with the concept at all. So if you go to the next slide, we asked them, how do you think you would compare to your peers, thinking about ESG work? And a little bit less than 40% of recipients or respondents said that they thought they'd be kind of average with their peers. About 15% said they thought they'd be leading the way, which is great. But about 45% said the teal bar says we don't do any ESG work or reporting, and then the yellow bar, a little less than 20%, saying we don't think we compare very well, kind of below average. So it definitely seems like there's opportunity to kind of create more awareness and improve what nonprofits are doing in the region on ESG and sustainability. If you go to the next slide, we asked folks how did they think that ESG work or reporting might be beneficial for nonprofits. And here you can see the top three answers, really looking at the green, the teal, and the eggplant colored bars. The first answer was better decision making. If we did ESG reporting, it would allow us to make better decisions, and that's presumably because you would be looking at annually at sort of data and where you are, status, progress against goals. So that was the top answer, and pretty closely tied to the teal bar, which is the response is that it would help the nonprofit to communicate or demonstrate their mission to their stakeholders. And then the eggplant colored bar is a response which we sort of mentioned earlier, that reporting on ESG would help to recruit or retain employees. So those are the top three answers, and kind of following close behind in the orange bar was donor attraction and retention. Now this was a little bit surprising to me, actually, that the donors fell behind those others. So we can have more of a discussion about that later. If you go to the next slide, let's see. We also asked the question of just who did the nonprofit leaders think was most likely interested in ESG or ESG reporting? And you can see here in the yellow bar, the top answer was that executive leadership was most interested, followed by employees of the nonprofit, and then board members. And again, in the sort of fourth place was donors being interested. And then, yeah, you can go ahead. And then, so I think we want to talk more about this again in the discussion. And so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just from our perspective at Sustainability Next, here are some of the obstacles for nonprofits paying more attention to ESG issues. And I think, and this is true for the corporate sector as well, one of the issues is just that organizations tend to work in silos, and so they're separating environmental and social and governance issues, and different people are doing those jobs, and it's not being looked at holistically. So that is definitely one of the barriers, and as well as it's kind of sometimes there's a lack of leadership around this. It's no one's specific job to look at these issues holistically. Sometimes we just don't have data, or there's not a good data collection system to measure progress, and sometimes it's just lack of awareness or unfamiliarity with ESG and reporting and standards frameworks that could help entities to do this work. And of course, there's always an issue of resources and how resources are allocated towards initiatives. Those are just some ideas that we had, but we definitely want to talk with you more about that. And look at the next slide. We had also some thoughts about where we can start. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think we want to hear from you, and I want to hear from the other panelists about this, but certainly we just need to start having more conversations at the board level, executive level, and employees, and also externally with our stakeholders to figure out what's really important for the organization, to our constituents, and sort of that helps to guide where we're going to start. And one of the things that we recommend is that you can do kind of quick sort of assessment, ESG assessment, to sort of find out, where you are, where your stakeholders are, and that's a service actually that my company offers. And the next slide just shows a little bit more about our approach to that rapid assessment, which takes about 6 to 8 weeks or so. And then by the end of that, we can provide kind of a plan, kind of a little bit of a roadmap for where to go next. And I'm happy to talk to anyone about that further. And then I think you can move to the next slide, which is really just my contact information, as well as a link to a blog post that we did recently that has more details about the survey that I was just discussing, and kind of our thoughts around our ESG in the nonprofit sector. So I think I'll wrap it there, and looking forward to more discussion and dialogue with folks on the panel and others. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anne. Really great to set kind of a foundation. And so just before we jump into, hearing a little bit more from our other panelists, I'd love to circle back to that word cloud. I know some of you were able to, put in what you feel like the value of ESG is to your work. Love seeing the word important, big and bold up there. That's really great. Sustainable, longevity, implement, investment. Really love landing on that one. So thank you all for participating in that, and I'm sure some of these values will come out as we speak with our other panelists. So I'd love to introduce Dan Miller, who's sitting here with me. If Dan is the development lead for Grid Alternatives in San Diego. Dan, if you could just start off and give a brief introduction about yourself and your work, and how ESG you approach it within your work.
Sure, thanks Darby. Hi folks, Dan Miller here. As Darby said, I'm a development officer for Grid Alternatives here in San Diego, and I wear a couple other hats in the community as well. I'm a community organizer first and foremost, and so when I think about ESG and my approach to ESG, it's less of something to be integrated, but more values to lead from, which I think Anne did a really great job of kind of outlining how we can lead from those values and lean into ESG. So I really think about what are the opportunities to connect the priorities of the organization with the priorities of the community, because when we start prioritizing our values first and foremost over anything else, then we really get to the chance to be community centered and to be asset framing in this work. ESG, I think, shows up through my work at Grid Alternatives, probably most obviously and most easily. It is the nation's largest solar nonprofit installer, and we also have a workforce development component that really brings out this triple bottom line of people, planet, and employment. So there is no part of my work as a development professional and as a community organizer is around decolonizing the way that we approach these concepts. There really is no separation in the natural world of the environmental or the social. They exist together, and to start decoupling and compartmentalizing, I think, is where these topics start to seem really large and insurmountable and difficult. And so what I like to do is kind of pull back and say, okay, what is it really that we're prioritizing when we decide to prioritize these things in our work? And how do we, at the same time, let go of the pulls and contradictions that come with operating in the nonprofit space? So if we're being really value-driven, sometimes that we don't always need to tie that to a metric. We don't always need to tie that to something necessarily concrete, and we don't always need to be focused on what is going to be donor worthy. It is worthy if the values are aligned with what the community wants and needs, and helping the nonprofit and its governance structure align with those desires. So I think I try to bring the community voice into my perspective as a nonprofit development professional, and make sure that we are meeting not only in a middle ground, but on a path forward that really honors where communities are coming from, honoring them where they are instead of where we'd like them to be, and then adjusting the nonprofit sector however we need to accommodate the true transformation and reconciliation that I think can happen when we have things like ESG present in our workplace and in our organizations.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan. And so I'd love to turn it over to Anna Diaz, who's joining us, who's a partner with Donald and Yankee. And so Anna, if you could share with us, how you approach ESG, in your work, and a little bit about that.
Absolutely. Thanks, Darby, and great to be on this panel with all of you. So yes, I'm a partner and lead advisor with Down and Yankee Wealth Advisors. We are an independent wealth advisory firm here out of San Diego. We've been here for 30 years and work mostly with individuals, families, and nonprofit organizations on their investment strategies and their financial planning. And as we do that work, and especially as it involves the financial side, you really can't design solutions until you know what the purpose of that wealth is, the wealth that's been accumulated. And that goes back to values, kind of as we've talked about earlier in this conversation. And ESG is absolutely integrating into that dialogue, both on the nonprofit side, as endowment assets are managed and other pools of capital are managed, but also on the donor side. And we see that too, as we work with individuals who are very charitably inclined, care about a lot of aspects of ESG and maybe all of those, and want to see that incorporated in the organizations that they support. So, as we go through this, and I know Anne did a great job of highlighting this, but we'll see this more. ESG from our lens is a very non-linear journey. It ebbs and weaves. It's defined differently by different people, by different groups. And so much of the important work that we try to do is to, on the front end, understand what really are we trying to instill in the decision making of this organization, or the values of this family, the values of this organization, and how does that translate into investment strategy, into the financial decisions that might be made. One of the word bubbles that came up was implement, and I appreciated that a lot, because that gets tricky, and we'll dig into that a little bit more as the conversation continues. But as you start to implement this, good news is that this part of the investment field has evolved tremendously and grown tremendously. That's the good thing. There are also a lot of solutions, and there's some dynamics and challenges with some of that as boards, investment committees, individuals try to implement some of these in the things they do. So I'm glad to be part of the panel and look forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And Anna, you really kind of jumped us right into the first question I'd love to, prompt us with here, is thinking about that implementation and thinking about, the work itself. So I'm wondering if our panelists, if you could share some examples of how, the different pillars of ESG have been manifested in the work that you've done, either with, organizations that you've supported, or, work that you've directly been involved in.
I'm happy to start. Would you like me to start?
Great.
Absolutely. So in the work that we do, we as I mentioned initially, we take the time to first define what that means. So if a nonprofit organization says, gosh, I really do want to incorporate aspects of ESG or all of them into the work that we do, specifically into the endowment or investment assets, we do want to define what that means. And I've been in many of these meetings, and they mean very different things to very different people. Not only do they mean different things, but then how someone or a group chooses to measure that starts to get even more involved. And so taking the time to first define that, and then saying, let's define what success looks like if we were to have integrated these aspects into the work we're doing, into the financial side that we're doing, and documenting that. And we can talk about it a little bit further, but that's a really important part. In real life execution, it's good to understand a little bit of the ESG landscape on the investment side, which is more, again, the lens that we look at this as we work with our clients. But there are three general stylistic kind of categories out there. There's when looking at the investment side, there's the exclusionary approach, there's the single themed approach, and there's the best in class approach. And so what does that mean? So exclusionary approach is we are specifically going to exclude these areas because they conflict with our mission, because they're against our values. You might be against weapons or mining or tobacco. Those are examples. Then there are single theme strategies. Someone may say, I really, there's an organization here in California that said, we really want to focus on organizations that have at least a female board member. And so that's a single themed approach, or solar or water, single themed. Best in class again, on the investment side, it says we are going to continue to invest in a diversified portfolio. And as a reminder to all of us, we all have a fiduciary obligation in doing so as you manage endowment assets for the nonprofit or even individual assets. So now we're going to have a diversified portfolio. We're going to choose to invest only in the best in class in that particular sector. Those companies that stand out amongst their competitors of successfully incorporating ESG criteria into the way they operate. So knowing that's the landscape, that's kind of a starting point how it's identified. And then you start to look at ratings. And this gets complicated, and I'm so glad Anne showed that visual there. There were 3 different general, most well-known rating agencies out there that rate companies based on their ESG practices. Refinitiv is one, MSCI is one, and Sustainalytics of Morningstar is the other. But they don't always agree, and they all have very different criteria. And so, for example, Tesla, a company that everyone knows and has, love or hate relationship with, one rating agency said we rank them extremely high due to their electric vehicles. Another, on the complete opposite side, say we rank them extremely low due to their factory emissions. And then one was in the middle saying they have electric vehicles, but their lithium mining is concerning to us. So you can see that as you say, gosh, I really want to implement this into the work that we do, it starts to get a little gray. So really taking the time to identify how are we going to define the success, what are the metrics we're going to use to manage that and oversee that, and how do we monitor it over time?
Great, thank you so much, Anna. I know, metrics and how we talk about or, move these spaces forward is really valuable and important. So I'd love to hear from, Dan or Anne if they have any responses to this question of how ESG is manifested in your work.
Anne, do you want to go first?
Sure, thanks, Dan. Just because I think I really eager to hear what you have to say, Dan. But I think mine might be connected to what Anna just said about kind of the metrics piece. And in my work with organizations, that's often how ESG is manifested is when an entity decides it needs to focus on a particular topic within one of these categories or multiple topics within these categories, and they make a commitment around that, set a goal, set a target, and figure out what the right metrics are to measure that. So organizations I work with have been, looking at, especially in the last year, but it started quite a bit before this, looking at policies and procedures and targets around diversity, equity, and inclusion for their employees and board, or they've been, committing to more transparent and equitable remuneration and compensation policies. What's the difference between what the CEO or the president of the nonprofit is making and what the employees are making? Like, what is that factor? And trying to close the gap a little bit from an equity standpoint. On the environmental side, of course, we're seeing a lot of organizations make commitments around, going 100% renewable energy by X year, or reducing their emissions by 50%, by 2030 or something like that. And so they're setting targets, they're setting metrics, and they're creating action plans to reach those goals. We see same even on the governance side, where entities are really striving to make sure that they're creating clear, conflict of interest or policies or sexual harassment policies, hotlines that people can call if there are conflicts of interest or they're seeing issues with that, and then doing annual training to make sure that everyone in their organization is aware of those things. So there's a in a very concrete terms, there's that's how I'm seeing it manifested in the work that we do with organizations.
Thank you so much, Anne. Dan?
Yeah, I think I appreciate that Anna brought up that we start to get into some of the abstract a little bit when we really think about measuring and how we're assessing sort of this impact. And I really appreciate that because there's actually, I think, a lot more of the abstract that can't necessarily be measured when we are really manifesting and really living out these sort of, like, again, my approach, I think, is more rooted in the values and the principles and the concepts and kind of more of that abstract, because I'm in the nonprofit sector where a lot of that work is already very mission driven. It is already centered around values. So when I think about ESG and sort of the journey that one can embark on or that organizations can embark on when choosing to prioritize these things, I think a lot about, so for GRID, we have a corporate workday program where folks who give into our corporate, are part of our corporate giving get to actually be a part of a work day where they come out and be a part of some of the builds where we're installing solar. And so there's that aspect of it. And how do we take that even further to really provide an opportunity for cultural exchange? And we install solar for communities of concern, so folks who typically might not be able to afford it, we're able to actually give them no cost solar, which is incredible. But there's an opportunity for exchange for that homeowner. We don't approach that work as just going out and installing solar panels on someone's roof, but there is an exchange there. Someone is inviting us to be inviting us to their home, number one, inviting us to be a part of their community, and then there's an opportunity for cultural exchange in the sharing of a meal, the sharing of stories. It goes much beyond just the fact that we're there to make an environmental difference by installing solar panels on someone's roof, but that there's stories that can be exchanged. There's so much more there's an opportunity for richer and deeper connection. So when I think about the way that ESG has shown up in my work, I guess I think more about the different organizations that I've worked with that really try to help make those connections. Another organization I'm involved with is the San Diego Urban Sustainability Coalition, and we empower community members through building their skills of community organizing and environmental literacy, and then encouraging them to go into their communities and identify projects that it could be any type of sustainability-centered project, but a lot of times we end up seeing them in food justice. We see them trying to do cleanup and beautification. Sometimes there's even projects with water, because we do have issues with clean water even here in the US, even though I think the perception is that that's more of an issue that folks address abroad in development. So the way that I think this work shows up for me a lot of times is just helping draw those connections, and also helping draw the connection between these modern concepts of sustainability back to the traditional ecological and indigenous knowledge from which they come. And when I think about ESG, I really see an incredible opportunity to institutionalize that type of traditional ecological and indigenous knowledge. I think looking at the metrics, looking at the investability of things like ESG in whether that's the nonprofit or for-profit sector is really an opportunity to give more weight, validity to that type of knowledge that has existed since time immemorial, but now we see it introduced back to us in these different sorts of ways.
Yeah, that's really wonderful. I hear a lot about, there's kind of some different ways that we can approach metrics, right? Anna brought up the, 3 different, agencies that are tracking these and how they can be measuring them differently. So I think it's really important for nonprofits to assess their internal values and how, metrics like Dan mentioned, going into people's houses, making these really strong community connections, can maybe be a metric that you're tracking in a way of how that's providing value. I think that's really wonderful, and thank you all. I'd love to transition a little bit to challenges and barriers. It's not always easy to depending on what kind of nonprofit you're coming from to either approach these dialogues or conversations. So I'm wondering if you all could share some experiences that you had and maybe some challenges or barriers that folks who are willing to start this ESG journey can maybe anticipate, to kind of prepare folks for what's to come.
I could maybe start. I touched a little bit on this earlier, but in the nonprofit sector, there's always this question of, is it going to be attractive to donors? Is it going to be a donor-worthy endeavor? And I like to push back against that question by inviting us to really think about, if we're a part of the nonprofit sector that's meant to sort of remedy and be a counterpart to capitalism and consumerism, and the only thing that we're concerned about is whether or not we can get money for it, then we've actually traded in a lot of those values and a lot of that mission that we were holding true and holding to heart to begin with. So less and less do I want us to think about whether or not something like ESG is a worthy endeavor and worth implementing and donor worthy. It needs to be, I think, that are we willing to place that much emphasis on our values? Are we willing to be bold when it comes to approaching our donors and our funders and communicating to them about our priorities and what really matters to us? And really, are we willing and able to put people first? I don't want to see, the last thing I think anybody wants to see in the nonprofit sector is folks sort of hiding behind their values or hiding behind their mission and vision. And I think being bold, being demanding, and being willing to say, no, this is what's important to us and this is how we're going to make it work, that to me is a really empowering place to approach this work from.
That's great.
Yeah, I agree with you fully, Dan. I think that it has to be mission driven, values driven, and I actually do believe, and I think there's evidence of that. If the nonprofit approaches it that way, the money, the donors, et cetera, will follow, because you'll have more success if you're being true to your mission and values and the needs of your communities and stakeholders. So I really agree with you there. And I also agree with your point about, just to go back to the last question, about kind of making the connections between these issues, not just through metrics. I think metrics are important or can be important, but also through storytelling, which nonprofits typically are great at. But maybe we're not telling the ESG story as much as we should now, but I think there's a lot of opportunity there to make these connections. And you just gave some great examples from Good Alternatives and others. But yeah, I think some of the other barriers are just, what I see, and again, this is very practical, concrete terms, but a lot of times it's just no one's job to pay attention to these things. Like I work with a nonprofit that serves low-income people in a really rural area of Maine, actually, and which is where I'm from originally. And they were trying to, they do a lot of transportation, like serving clients who don't have any transportation. You're in a rural area, so you really don't have much public transit. So this organization provides rides to doctor's appointments and things like that, to go grocery shopping. And they were trying to kind of decarbonize their fleet so that they could have the rides to have fewer emissions. Seems like a no-brainer, but the person who was in charge of, kind of organizing the rides and working with the low-income families through this has no background. There's no one in the organization who had any background on electric vehicles or anything like that. And just, he was just passionate about the issue personally. So he was doing all this grant writing and research on the side by himself, very little, organizational support, just because he was interested in it. And it was, and at some point, sometimes the whole process was slower for him to actually get that. He did eventually was able to get some electric vehicles to do this work, but it took a lot longer because, his regular job that he was, he had to report to his boss on did not at all include this kind of work. And I see that over and over, both in private sector and nonprofit organizations, where it's just, again, we're back to that silo issue, but it's like, whose job is it to really be looking at the intersection of these social and environmental and ethical equity issues and knit them together? So I think that is one of the challenges and barriers. I do believe it can be overcome though as well.
It's a shared responsibility, and how do we communicate about that responsibility and put that sort of collective problem-solving space, make that space, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Anna, I was going to jump to you, so sorry.
That's great. No, I was excited about the comments, because I'm actually seeing more of this organic co-learning, in the sense of, those comments of, we want to be careful about this not being a donor-supported approach that we're taking for whatever reason. No, we're seeing donors saying, this is something we feel passionate about, and we would like to see the organizations in which they are meant to have really strong social influence incorporate more of this and in different ways. And they're learning from each other. Donors are saying, oh, okay, you're defining it this way. And the nonprofit organizations are also learning from the charitable community, from charitable donors. So I think that's a good thing to see. I also will say, when you're going back to the challenges and the barriers, what is hard to watch at times is that there are scenarios where our clients want to embark on this and they're fully committed. But once you start to open the Pandora's box of ESG, it gets unwieldy. It is a pretty big area, and these are sometimes the words we use are very general in nature. And so it does take some time. And I've been in many investment committee meetings or board meetings where it's kind of going in circles because someone feels very passionate about this area or another about this area. And then it's hard to determine, how do we take that first small step forward in truly integrating this into how we operate? And so getting some guidance and having facilitated conversations we have seen has been more helpful, and being able to start to implement this. And then also being willing to recognize it's going to be a journey. It's going to be a journey that will not have perfected at step one, but you will along the way, because there's a lot of learning that happens. The last thing I'll share is just the controversy that can happen around the economics of this. And just to organizations that are embarking on this, to be prepared for that, because you'll have dialogues recently. Just to give you an example, so our first 2020 on the positive side was a record year. I think that the math was there were 17 trillion in U.S. assets that were held by investors who are applying ESG criteria to their portfolio. It's incredible, the growth that we've seen. You're also seeing there was public news of Norway's sovereign wealth fund, one of the largest in the world. They hold like almost 2% of all stocks, bonds, and real estate in the world. And they pulled out very recently out of, I think, 42 different companies. There are power producers and mining companies. There's this huge pull of capital that's really driving some of this on the economic side. But then on the flip side, I was in this board meeting not that long ago where someone on the other side said, hey, wait a minute, just so you know, Japan's government pension investment fund, which has about 1.6 trillion of assets, they went heavy on ESG in 2017, 2018, and 19, and they recently announced very publicly, we're pulling out. Our obligation is to support the aging Japan. And there were some performance dynamics that then said, wait, we have a fiduciary obligation, and we're actually giving up some on performance, and what specifically they were doing. So being educated on some of both sides of this conversation and understanding that is helpful, so you can really try to keep organizations moving forward on this path.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable of understanding, just like the impacts and the economics and, how to broach those conversations is really, really valuable. Just being mindful of time here, we have about 3 minutes, so I'm wondering if we could take one question from our audience, and maybe panelists could do a little bit of a rapid fire. So we have a question from Dahlia here. Could you provide some specific examples of an ESG strategy?
I can take that one, and I assume the question might be on the investment side, so I'll answer it from that standpoint. Absolutely. So there are no shortage of investment solutions out there now, in the sense of funds that you can buy, ETFs that you can buy, which are low-cost solutions to this. And you can also just research a particular stock or bond and identify its rating. But an example would be a core ESG fund on the environmental side. So a fund like that might say, we are going to follow the environmental impacts of particular companies in this relative to their index. So, for example, Anhan showed a visual of compared to the S&P 500, which is the 500 largest companies in the U.S. They built kind of a proxy similar to that, but we want to find the best companies that address two things, and these are what I most commonly see: emissions intensity exposure and potential emissions from reserves. And so having these companies and this fund that would invest in companies that follow to those two metrics, in theory, are supposed to be environmentally improving the scenario that we have. That's an example of the types of things out there. And there's no shortage of investment solutions continuing to grow in the space.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Dan or Anne, if you have any responses to that, otherwise we can take one more quick question.
Let's take another question
Awesome.
if we
So it
can.
looks like a great session. Thank you. What is the biggest challenge today for nonprofits, according to your experience, with regard to their corporate partners when initiating the discussion on investments or involvement in ESG? Great question.
That is a great question. I'm going to think on it for a minute.
It's a really good question. I mean, this is a kind of a generic answer, but based on some nonprofits that I've been working with and a lot of work with the private sector, I think there's kind of a challenge around, I don't know, if authenticity, or like I think there's some wariness on both sides about working between the nonprofit and for-profit sectors around, well, what is the motivation for corporate partners in terms of getting involved with a nonprofit, and trying to address some of these environmental and social issues, and just on the sort of, I'm having a hard time articulating it, but I'm just seeing that there's a little bit of, I think maybe to Anna's point previously, some co-learning that needs to happen, and dialogue that needs to happen around what are really our intentions and our motivations around this and our ultimate goals. And I think sometimes the nonprofits and corporate partners are going into conversations and not quite speaking the same language and sort of defining the issues differently. So I think there just needs to be some kind of foundation building and relationship building around what do we really need and what are we after, and how do we know that each partner is genuinely committed to sustainability and ESG.
I think that's where the nonprofit sector thrives, is giving those opportunities to come to that shared understanding, because it is so important.
Yeah, that's really great. I think, we talked a lot about values and really coming back to that, how are your values manifesting through impact? So we are at time. I just want to say thank you so much to those in the audience who took the time to hang out with us today, and to Dan, Anna, and Ann, our panelists. Really wonderful discussion, and I'm hopeful to see more ESG principles and strategies as we move forward. It was really valuable to see Ann's data, so hoping that bar keeps getting higher. And thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.